Hi, everybody. My name is David Vest. I'm a licensed marriage family therapist and one of the amazing therapists here at the Counseling Team International. I wanted to thank all the first responders and essential personnel that are still working through this crisis of COVID, the pandemic. And thank you for everything that you're doing. With some of the sheer boredom and some of the sheer terror that goes along with this type of pandemic. One of the things that I wanted to kind of address was the idea of grief and loss that is associated with a pandemic, as well as kind of moving through this. There's been a lot of people that have lost their life. There's been the potential for loss of life. There's been a loss of a lot of different things, normal activities, normal functioning, the way that you go through your normal day. There's a lot of different loss and grief. Grief is typically, when we look at grief, we're looking at there's some type of immense sadness or feeling towards something being gone. And oftentimes when we're dealing with grief, it has to do with a relationship with more of an animate object, the grief of losing a loved one or losing an animal. Those types of relationships are a lot of times what we focus on grief. What loss is also there too, and we can grieve ideals that we've lost. We can grieve functionalities. I used to work out every day, and now all of a sudden with COVID, I can't, or I have to modify a little bit of what's going on. So I wanted to kind of address some of the key stages in grief, especially because we have lost people in there. Now, before I had talked about anxiety and stress, and stress is our reaction to tension, and anxiety is our reaction to stress, and so anxiety is this my kind of little definition of it is it's prevention of potential or actual loss. Well, once an actual loss has occurred, then we move into grief. And so there's 5 stages of grief. They kind of rotate in between. The Kubler-Ross provides us these 5 stages. So this wasn't necessarily my idea. I'm just kind of capitalizing on what the research that they've done and the theories that they've presented. We kind of go into our first option of denial. Did this really happen? This is that shock stage. Now, as I kind of explain all these 5 different stages, I want you to keep in mind that not all these stages are going to go from one to the other. There's no right way to grieve anything. We just know that these are the categories that a lot of people fall into. So if you can look at it as more of like, hey, these are the things that potentially we could see or potentially I'm feeling, but it doesn't have to go from one to the other in exactly the way that I'm kind of expressing this. But with that denial, we're kind of in that place of what really happened? Did it happen? I can't believe that this happened. I can't believe that anyone would allow this to happen. I can't believe that a higher power would let this come about, or that I can't believe that that person's so healthy. I can't believe that this happened to them. And so it's kind of going, or maybe I'm so healthy. I've always done all these different types of things. Why is this happening to me? That starts that process of grief, oftentimes, and that's the denial part. Within that denial, you can move to several other ones, but commonly we'll move into a little bit of depression. I can't tolerate this. I can't be a part of this, and I want to kind of move on from there. I just got to get out of here. I got to move on. I got to go. And so that depressive state is that sadness that we just are just, man, it's just overwhelming, and I can't really. I believe it now a little bit more, but man. Wow, my world just stopped because of this incident, because of this grief, because of this loss. Okay. Sometimes along with that, depression oftentimes can lead into anger, whether it's some form of clinical depression, or depression through grief. There's this anger part. And, a lot of people, when I'm expressing, anger, and I'm working in session with people clinically, and they're like, well, I wasn't mad at them. I'm not mad at any person. I'm not mad. How can I be mad at this? How can I, this is just an inanimate object. This is just a virus. This is just whatever. How can I be mad at it? And I like to encourage people to remember that there's all different sorts of flavors of anger. There's frustration. Sometimes there's this, isolating factor of, it shouldn't be. So this idea of right and wrong, black and white thinking types of things, those are all parts of anger as well. And there can be some elation. Well, you know what? This is just maybe a little bit kicking back into denial, and I'm just, I'm above this. This just isn't worth my time. It isn't worth my energy to deal with. So understanding that anger is a part of it, but it may not be that, screaming at the top of your lungs, shaking your hands, putting holes in walls. It doesn't necessarily have to be that type of anger. It can be a flavor. It can be a shade of anger, like frustration or, just confusion. Well, what do we do now? I'm just at a loss. What do I do? And oftentimes we have to do that because the way that we're doing a lot of our jobs now as first responders are completely different. The way that we're teaching right now is completely different. And so we grieve that. We really do grieve that in the sense that, wow, what do I got? I got nothing. This isn't the way that I've done it. This isn't, I set out to, go and help as many people as I can. And now I'm watching and I'm sending the ambulance in, as I'm a captain and I'm like, we're all gowned up and now I got to send somebody in because I don't want my guys, my team, my crew to get affected by this. And that's not the way it does. That's not what I got into this for. When I sat on oral boards when I was a police officer, and I can tell you that I didn't have anybody that came in that said, you know what, I just want to come in for the money. That's all I'm here for. Everybody came in and part of their employment interviews, and they would always say the same thing. At least one part that they would always say the same is, man, I want to help people. I want to be able to help people. And with these distances and the protective, the PPEs and all the other different things that are going on in COVID, man, it doesn't really feel like we're really helping a lot of people. In fact, we're watching people suffer, which creates our own suffering. And I'll have a little bit on suffering here at the end. But then we kind of get into what I like to really push people into is this bargaining part, because the bargaining part is when you start seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. The bargaining part is where you start telling your story. Way back in the old days, I have this vision in my mind that I share with people a lot. When people are going through grief, a lot of the things that I look at is we used to grieve differently, whether it was a wake where, we literally had bodies in houses and everybody would come over, pay their respects. Way back in the early 1900s, people would actually take pictures and pose the dead body. That was a thing. Even going back to, how it's demonstrated in Hollywood, you see some of these tribal types of groups that, they have this fire and everybody's kind of dancing around to celebrate it. In some traditions, especially over in the Middle East, you have feasts that deal with, some type of loss. And it's this idea of telling the story, trying to make meaning out of it, this bargaining part of, this is important. Now, that's the key important part to me when you're managing grief, is to start looking at, how do I tell the story? Because the more that we tell the story, the more normalized it becomes, better off we are. In first responders, I oftentimes hear, well, sometimes I don't like to talk about it because it makes me sad. And I'm like, well, yeah, depression's part of it. So if you understand that you're in grief, you have to be sad. And always remember that you have tear ducts for a reason. And it's not just to keep your eyes, nice and wet and lubricated, but it's because we're expected to cry. If you want to look at strength, go stand in the middle of an intersection and scream at the top of your lungs. See how many people think that you're strong. And then go to that same intersection and start crying. And how many people are like, wow, that takes some guts. It's understanding and getting over those types of things, because culturally, law enforcement, as well as individual races, ethnicities, sometimes there's this cultural background that we're just not allowed to be sad. And I disagree with that. And I think that you have to understand that is part of grief. Once we get through telling the stories and we kind of go down that road, then we get into this place of acceptance. Now, this place of acceptance is okay, I've told my story. I've gone through the denial stage, depression, anger, and now the bargaining where I'm telling the story. I'm telling how this impacted me. I keep telling the story to normalize it. And now I get to this, okay, so that happened. This pandemic is going to pass over. It's going to go. We're going to have that light at the end of the tunnel. And so what's our plan to move on? We've heard the federal government has the governor has some, maybe your city has some, or your organization, the county has plans, that plan to move on. And you as individuals need to make those plans as well. So after this is over, now what? Now what am I going to do? What does that look like for me to go through this and go, wow, I went through this, but there's hope. I can do X. I can be a part of X. When I get out of here, this is what I'm going to do. And sticking to it, that's kind of that New Year's resolution type of thing. But we're at that moment, I'm going to take my stimulus money and I'm going to go, on a vacation, whatever it might be. And I'm going to go, help support small businesses, whatever. I'm going to invest in the stock market, whatever it is. You have to have those plans of moving on and kind of going through some different parts. So it's understanding that these 5 little categories, the denial, the depression, the anger, the bargaining, the acceptance, these are all part of a model of grief. Now, the thing that I like to encourage people is that when you're looking at grief, you have to move through grief. Because if you don't, you'll be stuck at wherever you're at, whether it's depression, whether it's anger, whether it's the bargaining part. If you don't move through grief, don't worry. Don't worry. Grief will take all the time it needs in the world, and you could be suffering from grief for 20 years. Now, I told you I was going to tell you a little bit about suffering, and suffering is very easy in the concept of it and very difficult to deal with. But if you understand it, then it makes grief a little bit easier, because suffering we think of like, somebody starving or somebody being, in a bubble, or somebody being, everybody suffers every day. And the suffering looks like it's a need, want, or desire and an inability to achieve a different outcome. And so if you can kind of understand that we all suffer, there's always some form of grief. There's a loss of ideals. There's a loss of jobs. There's a loss of money. There's a loss of connection, and maybe even the loss of life. When you understand that is part of life in itself and it has to happen, it makes getting over it a little bit more motivating. It makes suffering a little bit more understanding that we all suffer, and that's part of us talking to others. That going back to that bargaining thing again, I emphasize the importance of bargaining and telling your story. Do not be afraid to tell your story, and if somebody is telling you your story, listen. One of the things that a lot of people struggle with in grief is, well, what do I say? And it's not about what you say; it's about being there. Because remember, what do we grieve a lot of the times? We grieve relationships. And so if you're there in this loss of a relationship, there's nothing you can say that's going to bring that relationship back. There's nothing you can say that's going to make that easier. But you being there, listening to the stories, understanding that these 5 things exist in the model, you can just be there. And oftentimes as a clinician, that's the extent of what I do. Now, I'll ask some provocative questions to see kind of some different stages, or encourage that these stages are going to occur, but it's being there. I don't offer a trade. I don't say, well, you'll have another relationship, or, all that. You don't need to say any of that. You just need to be there. And understand that this is all part of the grief and loss. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of concept. I encourage you guys out there, and guys being male and female, take the time to talk to each other about what you're going through. Understand these different concepts, because you're struggling out there with a lot of what we're doing. I hear it all the time in session. People are struggling with what their job means now because it's not what they got into. But it is still kind of, and there is this plan of we're going to make it through it. The pandemic isn't going to last forever. We're going to be able to make it through. Please, if you have any questions, contact one of us here at the counseling team. Set up an appointment to come see us. But hopefully this video will be helpful for you. And again, I thank you for all that you're doing. And if you need anything from us at the counseling team, please give us a call.